Dr. Professor Oliver Arthur Guseni Mutambara. Welcome to ZTN.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to share with your viewers.
Thank you so much for coming through. Could you just give us what you remember of the person Robert Mugabe and an insight into the person that he was and the personality of the man?
Let's start by saying that Robert Mugabe is a Zimbabwean giant. Robert Mugabe is an African giant. From 1960 to 2017, 57 years, he was at the front end of African politics, front end of Zimbabwean politics. Of those 57 years, 40 years, he was the key player in Zimbabwean politics. From 1977, after he was confirmed as the leader of ZANU at the conference in Maputo. And of the 40 years, 37 years was running the country. Legacy-wise, the land. Legacy-wise, education. Legacy-wise, liberation of Zimbabwe, liberation of South Africa, liberation of Namibia. Pan-Africanism, anti-imperialism. All those things are a solid foundation that Mugabe has given us. We must celebrate and build on that legacy. On the negative side, of course there were challenges. You can't be on top for 40 years and have no blemish. Okay? Gukura Hundi, Muramba China, mismanagement of the economy, corruption, and also high-handedness with respect to the opposition. But all those negative aspects do not take away from his heroism, a national hero, a Pan-African hero. In terms of the personal relationships, he was a charming man, a good sense of humor, a politician of conviction, very principled, well-read, solid institutional memory, presence of mind. So it was quite an honor, quite a privilege to work with President Mugabe for 5 years. But of course, we're coming from different political parties. Of course, I had fought him for 30 years. From 1987 as a first-year student at UZ to 2017, I was his opponent, his critic. So when I praise him, I do so as an opponent. I do so as a victim, as it were, of the system that he presided over. But I'm saying that does not, that experience, those mishaps, do not cloud my judgment of his achievements, does not cloud my judgment of his status as an African liberator. You know, 11 years.
And there was a certain warmth.
Jail.
And there was a certain warmth that he had towards you because of you shared this passion for education. Tell us about that.
Three things. First and foremost, I think the common denominator was education. He respected that I was a PhD from Oxford. You know, he's an Anglophile, was an Anglophile of sorts, and also he had a very strong affinity for education. That was the point number one in terms of convergence. Second point of convergence was history. I'm a very strong, believer in history. I'm a history buff, and he had so much history to tell me. So there was also convergence around history, but not only just history. My clarity on liberation, my clarity on the land reform program, the revolution, my clarity on Pan-Africanism. So he respected that, although I was in the opposition, I was very clear on liberation, very clear on the land revolution, very clear on the need for Pan-Africanism. The third area of convergence was that I'm very principled. If it's a no, it's a no. If it's a yes, it's a yes. No prevarication. So President Mugabe liked that. With Mutambara, he knew where he stood. So when I say yes, it's a yes, and I won't change. If I say no, it's a no, and I won't change. So those three foundations, those three pillars, education, clarity on liberation, Pan-Africanism as second pillar, and the third being principled.
And indeed.
And so we got along, and we spent a lot of time together, bilateral, just the two of us, 3-4 hours. Would talk and share.
And that's the bit I really wanted to hone into, because he was quite a towering figure. You said something very important, that he had a lot of history to tell you.
Yeah.
It seems whenever he sat down with us, he started, giving us certain history lessons, and he wouldn't talk about an issue in isolation. He would take you back to its history and say, this is where this story started. So instead of just telling you, for example, that, oh, today the Palestinian leader is here and we're standing shoulder to shoulder with them, he would take you back to the two-state solution, to, a lot of bits and pieces of history, and that's the sort of person that he was.
the importance of a historical perspective. Even today, as we review his legacy, some people just take one narrative and they push it. No, take a historical perspective. Look at the man's complete legacy. Don't just say Gukura Hundi, therefore. There's Gukura Hundi, there's Mrabachina, but there's also liberation, there's Pan-Africanism, there's education.
And there's 11 years that you were
11
about
years
to mention.
in prison, yeah? And also 5 years in the bush in Mozambique, yeah? And so I'm saying that we must always have a balanced view with what I'm calling the multiple stories about Robert Mugabe. Don't give us a single narrative. I've been looking at the Western media, Europe and America, they all talk about negative. In fact, the West is upset about land. They don't care about Gukura Hundi. They don't care about democracy. If they did care about democracy, they wouldn't be dealing with Saudi Arabia. They give Saudi Arabia what we call a democratic exemption. George Bush Sr. was in charge of creating Saddam Hussein once upon a time. Mobutu Sese Seko was supported by the Americans. So the Americans in Europe don't care about how we as the opposition were clobbered by ZANU in Zimbabwe. They don't care about that. They don't care about democracy as a value. Their obsession, their condemnation of Robert Mugabe is because of land, and where land was taken from white people to black people. But the cloud didn't say, oh no, dictator and this.
It's the land.
Summary is that I don't want to know what Europeans think about Mugabe. I want to know what you think, what black people think, what Africans think, what Zimbabweans think. We are the people who make a decision on who is heroic to our environment.
And what you say really echoes what South African opposition leader Julius Malema was saying, that, you know what, we want to know, we know our own heroes, and we know how to celebrate them, and we know what we should celebrate about them. And when you talk about land as being the real issue behind all this animosity, what then is the lesson that you want to give to the Zimbabweans post-Mugabe on what to do with that land to honor the legacy and to honor the real thing that blemished his view according to the West? Before
I go to land, let me start with a general perspective. When it comes to Zimbabwean national interests, when it comes to African interests, we are on our own. The Americans and Europeans could care less about us. During the liberation struggle, our Zanla and Zipra fighters were not trained in New York or London. They were trained by the Soviets, the Chinese, and the Eastern Bloc countries. Why not New York? Why not Britain? Because they could care less about our freedom and our democracy. When it comes to our land, they're not interested in getting the land to Africans. So I'm emphasizing the fact that, yes, we're going to have a relationship with Europe and America and so on, but don't be blind, deaf, and dumb. Don't be naive. The Americans don't care about democracy. If they did care about democracy, they would not have been having what we call the democratic exemption they give Egypt, the democratic exemption they give Saudi Arabia, okay? Now, coming back to land, what we need to do to honor President Mugabe on land is to make sure that, number one, we create what's called collateral value of land. Don't make land a dead asset. We must be able to borrow against land. Let's work on our tenure system, so that those on the land can go and borrow money against the land. Secondly, let's think about the infrastructure, the resources and skills required for land revolution, for land usage, so that the land can perform. Let us sweat the land by providing infrastructure, providing resources, providing skills, so that we can drive up use per hectare. We must move from land acquisition to land use, so that we can feed ourselves, feed the region, and not only that, also move up the value chain, value addition in agriculture, agro-processing. So all these activities, technology in agriculture, the fourth industrial revolution in agriculture, the technology, artificial intelligence, big data, blockchain technologies, robotics and mechatronics in agriculture. These are the things we can do to honor and build on the legacy of land, which we are being given by Robert Mugabe.
Absolutely. And perhaps to take you back to your personal relationship with him, do you remember the last conversation you had with him? Obviously, we saw you move out of active politics after the end of the tenure of that government of national unity. But obviously, you maintained a relationship beyond that with President Mugabe. Do you remember the nature of that relationship, and also perhaps the last conversation?
Yeah, we continue to keep in touch. I attended the wedding, Bona's wedding, I was there. I attended this Bandaka Jesse wedding, he was there. I attended Shamira's funeral. Those are my last activities where President Mugabe was present, where we got a chance to chat. But the most important period for me was the 5 years, from 2009 to 2013, where we were meeting as the three principals, Prime Minister Tsvangirai, President Mugabe and myself, every Monday, and also where I would meet with him, just the two of us, for 3 hours, for 4 hours, talking about everything and anything, you know. So very, very solid guy, very determined, very principled, you know, in spite of all the other things. We got to give credit where credit is due. And we must take the good with the bad. Let us allow our heroes to be complex characters. The Europeans do that. They celebrate Jefferson as a founding father in America. Jefferson was a slave owner, if not a rapist. Okay? John Kennedy, JFK, a hero. Yeah. But when you look at his history, he had issues of his own. Check out history. Churchill the same. So Westerners are smart enough to know that human beings are human beings. They make mistakes, they make good decisions. So let us allow our heroes, our black heroes, to be complex characters with good and bad in the same person. But we don't gloss over the mistakes. We pick up lessons from the mistakes. We learn what not to do from the mistakes. But we celebrate and build on the foundation of the good aspects of the legacy. That's my message to Zimbabweans, to Africans, as we mourn President Robert Mugabe, a giant from Zimbabwe, a giant from the continent. Look at the way he used to speak at the UN. Tell me one single African right now on the continent, with 55 of them running countries right now, not a single one of them has the pedigree of Robert Mugabe. Not a single one of them, without exception. Robert Mugabe is in the genre, in the category of Ben Bella, Kwame Nkrumah, Nelson Mandela, Sobukwe, Julius Nyerere. That pedigree of leader is now non-existent. These chaps here, these African leaders, have a lot to learn from Robert Mugabe in terms of defending African interests, in terms of standing up to power and being an independent, free-thinking African.
And indeed, he spoke truth to power, and you talked about learning. And just before we wrap up, Professor Mutambara, what personally did he bequeath you with? What personally did you learn from Robert Gabriel Mugabe?
I think the issue of focus. Whatever you decide to do, you must be focused. The issue of determination. Whatever you do, you must have determination. The issue of sacrifice. There's no such thing as a free lunch. When you take these radical positions, when you take these principled positions, there are costs. And be prepared to pay the cost for a principled position. And he borrows from Nkrumah that you should never compromise principles on the altar of expedience. That was Nkrumah's dictum, which President Mugabe lived.
And he lost quite a number of free lunches because of those principles.
Sanctions, all this, you know, if you are going to do something good for Africa, if you're going to do something good for the country Zimbabwe, if you're going to do something good for the black person, the odds are stacked against you. You are on your own. Black woman, black man, you are on your own. That's Biko. Absolutely. And we live that experience now. So we must be determined, we must be focused, we must believe in something. We must be politicians of conviction. Don't just be wishy-washy without an ideological base. Those are the lessons, those are the insights I got personally from President Robert Mugabe.
Professor Arthur Mutambara, thank you so much for being here with us and sharing your personal moments and your wisdom with regards the demise of arguably a great man and, as you say, an African icon. And thank you so much to our viewers who continue to follow our coverage. Indeed, as we have mentioned, we will continue to give you coverage from the Blue Roof to the airport to the parade.